Get our seats.
What's that?
Get our seats. Is it that time?
We're close to that.
Okay.
You don't know who the first person is to speak at the podium to introduce students, do you? Is it this gentleman here?
Thank you all for coming to listen to me.
Are you going to filibuster?
No, actually, him and I are just going to have a conversation.
We're just going to, it's conversation,
mic?
just the two of us. We're going
You guys are just
to
chat.
moderate. Yeah, right.
Fair enough.
Why do we always sit next to each other? No, I know. Well, I haven't done it either. But it seems for some reason that ends up happening quite a bit.
Gentlemen,
What's your name?
Jonathan Weinheim.
So,
Oh, Jonathan, are you going to be helping us moderate, or are you going to
I'm just going to do a little welcome here to the group, so thanks for being here. Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Weinhagen. I am President and CEO of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce. Excited to welcome all of you here today and thankful that you were willing to file into an auditorium when it is 75 and sunny outside. As you all know, we are ramping up for this fall's election, mayoral election. We are thrilled today to welcome a number of the candidates to present their viewpoints and have a great conversation as we ramp up towards the convention. Want to thank our co-host today, the Humphrey School, and with that, I will turn it over to Larry Jacobs and Lee Schaefer, who will introduce our candidates today.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Chamber, for co-sponsoring this event, and thank you to all of you who have come out. It's always good to see a great turnout, as is the case today. I want to welcome my co-moderator, Lee Schaefer. Some of you may know him. He's a columnist at the Star Tribune and the Business Page, and the columnist I go to for wisdom about issues related to business.
Thank you.
I just Lee and I wanted to just mention at the outset that we were very pleased to partner with the Chamber in putting on this event. But all the questions and the topics were chosen by Lee and I. Chamber had no role in this. And so they will reflect our views and Lee's expertise with regards to the economy and business and related issues. The format today is going to be a little different from maybe debates you've seen. We're not describing this as a debate, but rather as a conversation. I think we've all been to debates where you have a question and then the candidate will pivot to what they want to talk about, or it's the canned answer. And because Lee is a journalist and I'm someone who does a lot of media work, we're going to use journalistic approach of having a conversation. We're going to ask a question. If candidates veer really decidedly from the question, we'll gently and politely intervene. We're also going to, on occasion, ask follow-up questions, using our own discretion as to when that makes the most sense. We spent quite a bit of time coming up with these questions and some of the follow-ups. We're giving the candidates 60 seconds for their first answer and 30 seconds for a follow-up. So this should be pretty lively. We're going to move pretty quickly. I want to introduce very, very briefly the candidates, and then we'll get hopping. Ray Dean, state legislator. Tom Hoke, head of the Hennepin Theater Trust for many years and chair of the Minneapolis Downtown Council. Nikema Levy-Pounds, law professor and Minneapolis president of the NAACP. Jacob Fry, city council member. Mayor Betsy Hodges, right here. Al Flowers, community organizer. And Aswar Rahman, filmmaker. How was that? It's a lot of candidates. Thank you. Okay, good. Now we got that out of the way. Lee Schaefer, would you like to get us going?
Yes, I would. And we're using media rules, but no one's allowed to body slam me. So agreed with that. Our conversation today will focus on the economy, business issues as well. And I think we'd like to start the conversation with just this simple question. Are you seeking the support of business owners and leaders in Minneapolis? And Mayor, why don't you lead us off?
Well, yes. The success and thriving of business in Minneapolis is one of the reasons that we're doing well, and it's one of the keys to the future, as long as we make sure that we're doing it the right way into the future. So yes, I have been seeking and have gotten the support of small business owners, medium business owners, CEOs of large corporations, and people who work there as well.
Tom Hoke?
Yes, I am. Is this working? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I am. Currently, my position is that we have no plan for the future vitality of our city. But other cities do, and we should be playing in that arena. With the right resources, with the right attention, with intentionality, we can jump up on the national stage and we can have the kind of jobs that we really want in this economy and grow the vitality of our city. Boulder has done it. Seattle is doing it. Indianapolis has done it. Austin has done it, and we can do it too.
Mr. Flowers?
I'm seeking the support of the people this election. That's why I'm running, because the business is being taken care of. I think they've been taken care of by the City Hall and the City Council. So mine is a focus on the people that's stressing and going through equity concerns that the mayor and the City Council always talk about what they're going to help. But it hasn't happened over the last 10 years. So it's time for the people. It's a people campaign this time.
Councilmember Fry?
Yes, our campaign is seeking the support of businesses, business owners, and workers, and we're getting a whole lot of that support because what we've been doing in the 3rd Ward over the last 4 years has been working. We've had near record numbers of small and local businesses and large businesses opening in either the North Loop or East Hennepin, and it's because of a whole lot of collaborative work, working hand in hand with the community, neighborhood associations, developers, and businesses, ultimately to get a really awesome result, because that, at the end of the day, is really what this should be about. It's being in public service is about getting results.
Nikema Levy-Pounds?
Absolutely, I'm seeking the support of the business community. However, the reality is that I sometimes speak a truth that the business community doesn't always want to hear. And part of that truth has to do with making sure that we are looking at the racial disparities in terms of income, employment opportunities, and what that means for the economic vitality of our region. The times in which I have engaged the business community, I've often looked out and seen an audience that's 99% white. That's very challenging for a city that's 40% people of color. So I would ask that the business community be more open, that we're able to bring more balance to the conversation, and that we recognize that what happens to our poorest residents is going to impact the entire region. And so it's incumbent upon us to focus upon the issues that they face and to make sure that there's economic opportunity for all in our city.
Representative Dean?
Yes, I'm seeking the support of businesses, business leaders, and all of the things that I think make Minneapolis and the region a great place. But we also need to consider that over the past 5 years, we've seen a lot of prosperity that's happened in certain parts of our city and other parts that haven't benefited. And I think that the business community has a key role in that, because ultimately businesses are in Minnesota not because of our low taxes, not because of our mild winters, but because of a great workforce and a diverse economy. And if we don't maintain that workforce, our economy is not going to benefit moving forward. And I think that ultimately that's what's going to make Minneapolis less attractive for businesses.
Mr. Rockman?
Absolutely. Of course, we want the support of small businesses and the business community in general. And there's, I think, a tendency to make it so that there's this distinction. Business owners live in the city, too, most of the time. You know, they care about the issues of policing, they care about the issues of education. And so we cannot afford to start dividing ourselves up into, oh, there's this small group of people, the business community, and everyone else. We're all in this together, and that's why, of course, we want the support. But here's the biggest thing, and Kimberly Pounds touched on this, is that it is deeply tied into the larger issues of our city. The issues that affect our businesses are the issues that affect all of Minneapolis. So we are seeking the support of the business community, but that's including small, medium, large businesses, everyone, and of everyone in the city.
Thank you very much. I think now we'd like to talk a bit about what the Chamber of Commerce reports that the input of business falls on deaf ears at City Hall. Doing business in Minneapolis is challenging. I think we've had to acknowledge that some in city government see business as a negative force that exploits people. So I'd like you to respond to that. Do you agree? Maybe Ms. Levy-Pounds, you'd like to start off?
Sure. Well, I definitely agree with this perspective that our city government hasn't been the most responsive to our business community. And I think that there are a number of reasons why that is the case. You know, part of it has to do with the fact that we haven't had adequate representation of business owners within city government. And sometimes city government, unfortunately, operates in a silo. And I can say that as a small business owner with a business located in North Minneapolis, I face many of the same challenges. When I talk to minority business owners, they face many of the same challenges, and they feel that City Hall is not responsive enough. And I believe that what's happening to business owners and business leaders in the city of Minneapolis is a microcosm of the challenges that many of us face when it comes to city government being responsive. I think that business leaders expect a greater response because they're helping to enrich our economic vitality, but it's an epidemic problem within city government that they're not paying close enough attention to the constituents across the board.
We'd like to ask a follow-up question. You've made a big point about your campaign being oriented to making Minneapolis, as you've put it, a national leader in equity and justice for all. How does business fit into that strategy?
Well, business is a key part of ensuring that there's economic justice. So we know that Minneapolis is a very prosperous city, but primarily for white residents of the city. That's going to have a tremendous impact on affordable housing, on people's abilities to put food on the table and provide for their families, which impacts the overall quality of life of people in the city. And beyond that, there are concerns from people of color who even have bachelor's degrees and master's degrees about going and applying for employment and not being hired. That's a challenge within our business community. So we have to look more closely at our hiring standards, our practices, the criteria that are being used, and make sure that we're being equitable in those practices. And if business owners do not know how to be equitable, then reach out to those of us who have the expertise in that area, because the vitality of our city depends upon it.
Mayor Hodges, the initial question that Lee asked about whether you agree that there's kind of a hostility in city government towards the business community.
Well, I would say, yes, there is a challenging business environment in Minneapolis. It's why I spent the first year of being mayor walking around the city, doing focus groups, talking with business owners about what is their experience, good, bad, and ugly. And from that came the set of recommendations we call Business Made Simple. How do we get to be a get-to-yes city? We have regulators who need to say no, and they're doing great work. But we also need to make sure we are valuing and letting people know that we value the investment that they're making in the city. We want people to invest in the city. And how do we get to yes? And so those recommendations are anything from you don't need a jukebox license in Minneapolis anymore. You're welcome. To making sure the right hand and the left hand know what the other is doing. And sometimes there were staffing issues. All of that was in Business Made Simple. I don't agree, however, that the needs and the requests and requirements of business fall on deaf ears at City Hall. Disagreement doesn't equal deafness. There are things about which we have disagreed, and I've done my best to make sure that we have the respectful conversation, that people know that they've been heard. I reflect back, am I hearing what you're saying? And at the end of the day, if we disagree, to communicate that. And the advantage I've given as mayor is I've been open about that from the beginning. If we disagree about something, I tell you from the beginning where I stand, and people know that, and I take hits for it, but at least I'm transparent.
So we wanted to ask about one of the episodes over the last couple of years, and it was when you had come out in support of new ordinance relating to scheduling. And there was quite an outcry from the business community, and we've heard from folks in the business community that they felt they were not heard. This seems to be an example of what the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce is talking about, of an example where there was a policy proposal put forward and their voice was not part of it. There was an outcry, and then you kind of stepped back and said, wait a second, now I do have to kind of go back and talk to business leaders. Is that accurate, or do you find that?
Well, Larry, I would say that's the definition of being heard, first of all. That, yes, there was a scheduling proposal that I put on the table as part of the larger Working Families agenda. Learned a lot through that process about timing, because I did talk with business leaders before I put that on the table, let folks know that was coming. But clearly, we've learned a lot since then in the process through Earn Sick and Safe Time, minimum wage. But the challenge with scheduling was less the process and more that on the timeline we had given ourselves, we could not find a remedy to a real problem. There are bad actors who are taking advantage of employees in terms of scheduling. We couldn't find a solution to that problem that didn't create too much of a burden on the good actors who were doing right by their employees. And we have not yet found that solution. I don't think there's a city in the country yet that has. But the lessons we learned from what went wrong, we use to make go right moving forward. But I will end with, pulling it off the table was listening.
Thank you, Representative Dean. Back to what we talked about, what I would call the falls on deaf ears at City Hall. Your thoughts, please?
Well, I mean, I've been at the state capitol, and I think business has a pretty good presence at the state capitol. I think it's critical to how we all do well, and some of us not so well. I would say that it's really critical that businesses don't feel that they're not part of the dialogue on what's happening when it comes to major policy issues. And that's the same for residents as well. I think there are some parts of how we function as a city government that makes it very difficult for people like they have the ability to access those individuals and be engaged in what I think are critical issues. If the first time residents or businesses find out about an issue is when they see it on an agenda for a city council meeting, we've lost. And I think that we need to create that dialogue in the network so that it's not just one group of folks, but it's actually a series of group of folks that we're having larger conversations with.
Mr. Flowers, this question about business concern falling on deaf ears at City Hall, is that a concern?
Yes, mine is more focused. They talk about business all. I don't think it's falling on deaf ears. I think what's falling on deaf ears is the people that's dying over North. When you talk about gun violence and business, it all go together. I worked with Senator Hayden and Senator Champion, who brought in over $70 million in equity to the state and a lot to Minneapolis that's not being utilized right now. So and to help create small business. I'm talking about work that's been done. And we sit here and the mayor, the city council, State Rep Ray Dean is sitting here, and they know the biggest issue in this city is about people dying. That's what we got to do. We got to shift this and put some focus on that. But they won't focus on that because of business development. That's what they do. They do work on that. I don't think they shortchanging business. Look what they did. They put a downtown plan together that's to stop people from coming downtown. But they did nothing about the violence on the north side and the gun violence. It all go together. If you don't fix that, then you're going to have problems downtown forever. And they're putting money into that. So we got to change this focus, this narrative, and quit leaving these people out. We got to talk about affordable housing, making sure the equity that they talked about 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago, and then when they get there, they do the same thing. So I'm not crying about what businesses they making money with. People are dying in Minneapolis, and we got to stop that, and we got to stop it now.
Thank you. Follow-up for Councilmember Fry. As we've talked about the falls on deaf ears, I think at one point you said a lot of the business climate is mentality. Entrepreneurs want to be wanted. Your views on that, and what would you suggest? You also supported, for instance, the minimum wage ordinance, which undoubtedly made some owners unhappy. So what's your sense of that?
Well, yeah. What I can say is that I am honest right from the beginning. Everybody knows that I'm a pro-business person. Everyone knows that I'm welcoming small business. I'm willing to work with them through the process. And by the way, business is not just one entity as a whole. We've got large businesses of more than 1,000. We've got mid-size of 100. We've got micro businesses that are just 2 people working in a shop. And so we can't account for them all the same. With minimum wage, I told them from the very beginning, you know what, look, I think this is the right direction to go for our city, and I held to that. Now, with scheduling, I also said that, look, I believe we need a more narrowly tailored ordinance to focus on the bad actors while allowing for the good to continue to do the right thing. So, there is some nuance that's required in all this, and throughout what I can say that I've done is I've been a coalition builder. I've worked with workers. We've gone back and forth on the paid sick ordinance to make sure that businesses were allowed to have that barrier right at the bottom, but they were also able to do whatever, they were also able to go above it and have some flexibility. And ultimately, you know what, it's worked. It's worked because we can show results in the ward in which I represent.
Mr. Koch?
So, the deaf ears, I think it's true. And let me talk about the $15 minimum wage. Now, let's be clear. I support an increase in the minimum wage. I absolutely do. But what the mayor and city council said they would do is they would hold a series of listening sessions. They would go out across the city and they would listen to what everyone had to say, including businesses, residents, others. Before that process was completed, the mayor and a majority of city council members had decided what the outcome was going to be. Now, if you feel like your pleas were falling on deaf ears, you have good reason to, because the process that they outlined wasn't followed. It wasn't really an opportunity for them to hear what you had to say. Was it political expedience? I'm not really sure. But I'm going to tell you something. When I'm mayor and I say I'm going to listen to you, that's exactly what I'll do.
Mayor Hodges, do you want to respond?
Well, I mean, there's a few issues that have been raised by some of my opponents here. I would say,
It's particularly this issue that Tom Hoke just raised about kind of the policy being a fait accompli. There was no listening; it was just kind of announced.
well, I would say this. I was at a number of those listening sessions. I did listen to what folks have said. I've been meeting with people one-on-one and in groups on my own as well. There are a number of issues at stake at minimum wage, and yes, over the winter, I was clear that for me, a tip penalty would not and should not be on the table. Yes, that is true. But for the other things, how long should the runway be, exceptions for youth workers, a whole number of questions that actually the council are going to be taking up this afternoon. Those questions, the answers are absolutely being informed by the feedback sessions that we had. I can't speak for the entire council, but I can speak for myself. But also that issue of transparency and, openness from the very beginning. I was clear from the very beginning that I would not support a tip penalty, and I know that Councilmember Fry was supporting one and talked to folks about it, and part of the challenge they have is they want the openness and the transparency. And so they're grateful that I said at the beginning, no, I don't support a tip penalty, even though they disagree with me. And there are some folks supporting me now just because of that openness, whereas they got one message behind the scenes and another up front.
Can I interrupt? I don't know what a tip penalty is.
In Minnesota, Minnesota is one of 8 states that doesn't have a tiered system. In other words, people who are servers in restaurants have the same minimum wage as everybody else has. And so one of the issues when you're considering raising a minimum wage is that consistently in Minnesota, as we've talked about raising the wage, people have said, well, we can do that if we create a tiered system. Is this about whether tips count as wages? Yes.
Okay.
And if servers get a different minimum wage than everybody else, and I have said no, there should not be a different minimum wage. We don't have one. I don't want to introduce that into this environment. The states that don't have one are doing better in the restaurant sector than other states are.
We're going to come back to this issue more. Just give us one more second. We want to finish this round on the deaf ears question with Mr. Rockman. When you look at City Hall and you hear folks at the chamber saying that our concerns are met with deaf ears at City Hall, does that seem right to you or not?
That rings absolutely true. So I come from a family of small business owners. When we got to the United States when I was very young, that's what kept our family, got us out of poverty eventually, was small business in Minneapolis. After that, my sister started her own. I started 2 of mine. I'm a web developer and a filmmaker. And here's the thing. In Minneapolis, business is viewed by the government as something to be done to rather than worked with. It's a subject that we throw laws at and see what sticks. So for instance, Mayor Hodges talks about we listened and pulled off the scheduling. They had to protest. They had to pull every single tool they had in their arsenal out in order to make sure that thing didn't pass. That's not listening. If somebody has to protest every day in order for you to listen, that is not listening. Same thing with the minimum wage ordinance. I think it's steamrolled over all the very legitimate concerns that business owners like my family members have. And these are not being listened to, absolutely. And we hear the exact same thing when the campaign goes out on West Broadway and we go knock on every single store and we go inside and talk to the owners. They all have at least 2 or 3 things that they have gone to City Hall repeatedly for that do not get taken care of, because in Minneapolis, business is something to be done to instead of worked with. That's a paradigm shift that needs to come, and that's what our election is all about, our campaign is all about.
Next round of questions.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the minimum wage. We may as well get right into that. I think one of the interesting questions is, which I've not heard anybody answer, is who's going to pay for it? And I think we need to openly ask your views on the question of economic theory and common sense would tell you that if your wages go up, there's going to be fewer hours worked and fewer jobs. So please take on that one. Representative Dean, why don't you lead us off?
Well, I'll start with answering the fact that over the past 3.5, 4 years, we've raised the minimum wage in the state of Minnesota from $7.25 an hour to $9.50, which puts an incredible amount of money into our economy, which has helped our economy remain strong. And no one was freaking out that was a 31% increase in the minimum wage. It was tiered, it was put in place, and I think that most businesses made the adjustment to what that meant. When we think about what we also did, we also had cost of living. So if we consider that we're talking about a ramp up that might be 5 years for $15 an hour, in the current wage, if we have a 3% cost of living every year, in 2022, the minimum wage will be over $11 an hour. So that increase to 15 is actually going to be less. It's about 26%. So when we talk about these numbers, we need to talk about what they actually mean, how they're actually going to be implemented, and ultimately, The customers will pay a little bit more, the businesses will pay a little bit more, but it's been proven out that as we pump more and more money into the economy, it benefits the whole system wide.
So let's just follow that premise. Would you support a $20 an hour minimum wage?
I think at this time, when we look at the issue of cost of living, I think that $15 an hour gets us closer to what it costs to live minimally in the city. But again, that's minimally.
But just using the logic of what you just said, that the minimum wage expands purchasing power, it's a kind of a win-win for everybody. Why not raise it to $20 an hour?
Well, you could then say, why not raise it to $50 an hour? I mean, I think that you have to be reasonable in what we do when we increase minimum wage, and we look at the incidence of poverty in the city, which is roughly 20 to 25%, and that's too great for a city that actually is very prosperous. So we clearly have a huge disparities, and the ability to make what I would say is drastic change, which some people would say changing to $15 an hour can be rather difficult, but if you really pare down the numbers and look at it closely, it's really not a drastic change.
So are you worried about the slowdown in job growth or loss of jobs?
As a result of increase in minimum wage, I'm actually not really concerned, and one of the things that we need to be sure we do is that we work with these businesses as we go through this process to institute increasing their wages. Some businesses will need some assistance.
What does work with mean?
That means sitting down, having conversations, having the business community be a driver of a conversation and not just being talked to as Oswar had spoken to. I mean, we're all in this together. To think that one group is going to have something being done and that it's not going to have impact and not going to filter out in other ways is foolish. And we need to make sure that it's a robust conversation. I think the listening conversations, what we're actually getting to are what are the things and how are businesses going to be impacted? And then how do we design a system that assists some of those businesses? And quite frankly, there are some bad players out there that may go out of business as a result of this. And it's probably good that they do.
Mr. Koch, this question about whether raising the minimum wage and the new sick leave policy is going to slow down or depress job growth. Do you agree or not?
Well, I'm not sure that we know. I don't think that there have been enough longitudinal studies that will tell us what the impact is. So we know that a minimum wage ordinance is going to pass. That's really clear. So the job of the next mayor is going to be to make sure that the ordinance is enforced and that we are staying on top of any unintended consequences. Because my feeling is that we don't actually know how this is going to play out, and we need to stay on top of it. But let me just talk about something else, because the reality is that, as I said at the beginning, we need to be thinking about how we're going to set the stage for greater job growth and good, high-paying jobs. We shouldn't be in the position as the city of waiting to see what happens to come across our doorstep. We can be active. We can make decisions about the kinds of jobs that we want, and we can go and we can play in that field and we can win. And I'm happy to talk to you more about exactly what those areas are.
Okay. Ms. Levy-Pounds, I think when you declared your candidacy in November, you said, I don't think $15 an hour is a whole lot. Maybe we're not asking for enough. Please tell us about your conversations among business owners after you announced or maybe prior to announcing and holding these views.
Well, I'll just give you an example of why I think $15 an hour is very reasonable and doable for many businesses. I was in the Herbivorous Butcher, a millennial startup in Northeast that focuses on vegan and vegetarian food, which is really delicious, by the way. But I had one of the employees approach me about my candidacy, and he talked about the fact that they are voluntarily trying to get to $15 an hour by August, that they're not going to wait for whatever the city does or whatever happens within the broader business community, but they think that it's the right thing to do. Why? Because they're focused on the quality of life of their employees and making sure that they're taking a holistic approach to addressing their needs, that their employees are able to get transportation to work, that they're not worried about being evicted or pushed out of the city, et cetera. And so that, to me, is the kind of mentality that we need from our business community as well. Because if I took a poll right now, I would guess by a show of hands, the majority of people would not be willing to show up for $15 an hour every day. That most of us have much higher expectations in terms of our socioeconomic outlook. So why would we continue to relegate those who are at the bottom of our economic strata to lower wages than what they deserve and what's necessary for the economic vitality of our city?
But just to pick up on this theme about the potential costs of a slowdown or actual loss of jobs, there are plenty of businesses who've said they're now looking at moving to a suburb, a nearby suburb, and many of them are good moral people. It's just their margins are so small, they feel like doing business in Minneapolis is too costly now. What are your thoughts about how to kind of calibrate the minimum wage with this idea of the cost of doing business in Minneapolis? Should that be a factor, or do we just, kind of discount that?
Well, Mayor Hodges and I don't see eye to eye on a number of issues, but there are some issues in which we do. And one of the issues that she brought up in the past is the fact that we need to take a regional approach to raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And I agree with that. But the reality is that we can't wait for St. Paul. We can't wait for other cities to do the right thing. At some point as a city, we have to become a leader. And for those businesses that are deeply invested in the vitality of Minneapolis, I would think that they would be willing to work hand in hand with the city on coming up with a solution that would allow them to move towards $15 an hour. And again, this is not a change that's going to take place immediately. This is a phased-in $15 an hour minimum wage that we're talking about here. And I think through collaboration, listening intently to all parties, it's possible to do it. Beyond that, it's the right thing to do. The city's own research that they commissioned through the University of Minnesota talked about a minimum wage needing to be at least $23 an hour to have a decent quality of life. And so when I talked about 15 not being enough, I meant it. And there's research that backs it up.
Understood. Councilmember Fry, maybe you'd like to address this, and then I probably have a follow-up for you.
Yeah, 2 years ago, before it was an election year, before it was politically expedient, I said very clearly that I was for increasing the minimum wage at the city. I said that I was for doing it thoughtfully, reasonably, not via ballot initiative, but digging in, being in the arena, and then ultimately hammering out these facts. And, we're about to do it. A lot of people can talk about it, but I'm part of the very small trio at the council that is ultimately going to get this done. And yes, I do think we can get this done effectively. And no, I do not think you're going to see a massive exodus from the city because we're going to do it right. I think there are some entities in this city right now that can and should be paying $15 an hour, but I do think we need to be accounting for some of these small local businesses that most definitely need a more significant phase-in. So inevitably, when you do it right, you're going to start getting hit from both sides. And, I've taken some punches along the way. But at the end of the day, we're going to have a minimum wage policy that is effective, that works for both businesses and workers, and then it uplifts our whole city.
Okay, as a follow-up, just quickly, I think there was a time when you supported treating wages as tips, and now you favor no exception for tipped workers. For voters looking for consistency, how do you respond to voters who are not sure that they can trust your positions on these kind of big issues?
I'm glad you asked that question. So,
you seem to mean it, too.
It's a good question. 2 years ago, and actually for about a year and a half, up until Mayor Hodges flipped her position to suddenly be for a minimum wage in an election year, it did not look like we were going to be able to get anything done. We were 3 or 4, and maybe 5 at the most council members that supported this. The mayor outwardly and internally opposed it. And then when she flipped her position, suddenly you had more council members coming on board. So there were more alternatives at play. So did we consider counting tips? Absolutely we did, along with about 15 other proposals as well, because we wanted to get this done in an effective way. And ultimately now we're going to get there. So, it's difficult leading the way on some of this stuff, but I think it's necessary. And by the way, when there was a ballot initiative that was coming forward as well, I also took some heat because a ballot initiative was also not the effective measure to get it done. Am I for a minimum wage increase? Absolutely. Am I against a ballot initiative? Also, absolutely. We need to account for nuance. We need to have engagement. We can't write a proposal that's going to remain steadfast right up until the day of the vote without the ability to get it changed. And we don't want to set a precedent that allows for anything at all to get on the ballot, including a referendum to freeze property taxes in place.
Mayor Hodges, who's going to pay for the new minimum wage of $15 an hour?
Which goes back to your original question. And I will be clear that I do support an increase in the minimum wage, and I've always supported an increase in the minimum wage at the largest possible jurisdiction for some of the reasons that we've been talking about here on stage. Concerns about the transition trough, as Minneapolis does it alone, et cetera. But your question is who pays? And yes, some of it will be paid for by the business, some by the customers, in some ways, sometimes by the workers. But I also think the question is who's paying now for the lack of a minimum wage? And we all are right now paying now for the lack of a minimum wage because of people being able to work full-time or 2 full-time jobs and still living in poverty. And people needing services and, taxpayer services that they won't need when they're not living at the same level of poverty when they get a minimum wage increase. And the other question is who benefits? And we all benefit. The worker will benefit. Yes, there's an issue of a transition trough, but that is a temporary situation. That takes place over, you get from here to there, and there's a trough in between where there will be some challenges. But on the other side, we will all be better off in our economy, and all of our people and our businesses will be better off. So yes, yes, somebody pays for it, but somebody's paying for not having it right now.
Okay. As a follow-up question, let's talk a little bit about Seattle. It's often held up as a reason why we here in the Twin Cities should adopt a minimum wage, or Minneapolis, of $15 an hour. I have a hard time seeing how this makes sense given that Seattle's housing costs and other costs are significantly higher than Minneapolis. What can be learned from a city like Seattle?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Because I have long said that Minneapolis is situated differently in our region than Seattle is situated in its region. It's one of the reasons our economics play out. It's one of the reasons our cost of living is different. We are a smaller overall proportion of our regional economy than Seattle is in its, which is why my position now is what it's always been, which is we would do better minimum wage-wise doing it regionally, and I pursued legislation to that end. And I was talking with legislators from around the region to move that this session. What happened was I didn't change my position, but the legislature changed theirs. And when the election happened and Donald Trump was president and we not only didn't win the House back, but we lost the Senate, it became clear that the path was very narrow to get legislation done for minimum wage at the regional level. Not impossible, but narrow. And at that point, knowing that Minneapolis was going to go it alone, I made sure that I am sitting at the table saying, this is what I'm going to need to see. So my position has been consistent the whole time. And for just the reasons that you outlined, we are situated differently than other regions.
Mr. Flowers, when you hear talk of a minimum wage going up to $15 or perhaps $23, does that strike you as a potential threat to the jobs that already exist, that they might leave the city?
I think this is the biggest ruse they playing in this election. $15 an hour. I was a small business owner. My family, we own the Early Childhood Learning Center. You got to pay the aides $15 an hour. Then what you gonna pay the teachers and the director? It'll kill it'll kill a lot of small business. The key to that is affordable housing. So that how we tied in, affordable housing is the real key to that. But for everybody to keep playing like we're gonna raise this to $15 an hour. Every poor person out there, every person making $7 and $8 and $9 an hour, gonna jump behind it. They'll jump behind that bandwagon and not knowing it's a political ploy. It's not gonna happen. You'll kill a lot of small business. You're not gonna grow small business saying you gotta pay them $15 an hour. You have to have other equity things in place like affordable housing. You gotta make housing affordable so some of this can be taken away. Because if you do business like that, they're gonna go to automated systems. You'll be talking. They'll send your hamburger out on a slider, and there your hamburger, pick your stuff up. That's what's gonna happen. It's not gonna happen. And I hate when politicians sit up and say they're gonna do this for poor people, bring their expectations up, and it's not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen. They could say it all day. It's not gonna happen. We have to find a remedy to affordable housing, and work with the wage, work with small business. Small business got to be at the front of this table, because Walmart, Target, these big organizations, they can handle $15 an hour. You'll kill all small business, and everybody up here knows that, including Anwar, who's a small business owner.
Mr. Rockman, who pays the cost of higher minimum wage?
Thank you for enforcing that. You didn't enforce that on the first four people, because we had phrases like pumping money into the economy. What kind of a statement is that? Money comes from people, you know? So here's the thing. So I am a small business owner, my whole family small business owners, and we pay people well. We make sure that we take care of the people who are in our businesses. We don't run a business that would operate on a minimum wage where the state level is now. And Al called it a ruse. It's also a trap. Here's the thing. Minneapolis is 40% minority, right? Guess what percentage of our businesses are owned by minorities? 10%. So that means 90%. This is a trap. It's a way to make sure we cement that gap, and in that gap is where poverty thrives, in that gap is where crime thrives, unaffordable housing thrives, in that gap. So to ensure that I won't be, well, not in our particular case, but to ensure that anyone who starts a business in a low-income neighborhood won't be able to hire their neighbors who aren't expecting $15 an hour to work at a new business. That is the surest way to make sure that Minneapolis stays an incredibly impoverished city for 40% of us. And it's ham-fisted political opportunism is what it is. And here's the thing. When we talk about where does this money come from, it does come from all of us in the room. And let me tell you, my heart is with you guys, but it's mostly within the low-income communities I grew up in. And over there, we are the ones who are going to have to pay the price for this. We won't be able to start our own businesses because it'll cost way too much in terms of labor. We will see a mass exodus. We're already seeing a mass exodus of businesses and low-income people, especially from North and Northeast Minneapolis. So ham-fisted political opportunism has no place in politics in Minneapolis.
Thank you. Next question, we're going to do another round. Mr. Flowers.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to ask about the Bank of Minneapolis idea that floated a little while ago. Several city council members requested that the city staff look into ending the relationship with banks like Wells. Within my office, I think there's at least 25 branches for banks. I'm not sure why the city needs to get involved with this. But focusing on the underlying concept, are you supportive? Mr. Flowers, you can start.
Well, I'm not aware of that, so I'm not going to speak on that unless you enlighten me a little more on what you're saying.
Well, the city staff was requested to report on the feasibility of the Bank of Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis actually developing a bank, or at least a quasi-bank.
When we talk about banks, I can tell you what the city should be doing, what I would be doing. I would be suing Wells Fargo, and that's what the city should be doing. When you talk about affordable housing, I said it earlier, and I'm gonna keep my pace on this. When you talk about affordable housing and what Wells Fargo had did to some minority communities. And if you go to other cities, Seattle, Memphis, where they sued the Wells Fargo Bank for what they were doing and to communities of color, that's the bank I want to work on. I'll let them continue to do that work, what they talking about, and I'll research it and look it up. But right now, the city should be suing Wells Fargo for their discrimination toward communities of color, particularly black communities. So I'll research that next time. You won't get me with the got you.
Mr. Hoke, as Lee mentioned, there's been discussion at the City Council about targeting banks that provide debt financing for the Dakota pipeline and fossil fuels, and that the issue is whether the city ought to end that relationship with those banks. And secondly, does it make sense to explore the potential of a publicly owned bank? What's your view?
Well, my answer is no. I think the city has enough on its plate before it enters the banking arena. And I do think, by the way, that there is the opportunity for constructive engagement. The city has a lot of influence and can encourage and even force banks to behave in certain ways when it operates in our city with our money. And that's exactly the position that I would take with them. If, by the way, you say that you will never sever ties with them, of course you undercut your bargaining position with them. So I would never probably say that. But the reality is that the city needs, we go back to tone deafness, relative to the business community and the city. And this feels like an iteration of that again. And my feeling is we have to have businesses. Wells Fargo, like them or not, and I'm not a big fan, by the way, of the money that John Stumpf got when he left Wells Fargo. I think that exacerbates the entire conversation that we're having about wage inequality and wage stagnation in this country. But the reality is they're a big employer in our city, and we need to constructively engage with them. We need them to behave in the way that we need them to, and we don't need to replicate a bank at the municipal level.
Councilmember Fry, what's your view about the city ending its relationship with banks that are involved in the fossil fuel industry, and secondly, potentially starting a publicly owned bank as an alternative?
Well, I am not for starting a municipal publicly owned bank, and I'll tell you specifically why. There's one publicly owned bank that I'm aware of in the entire country, and it's in North Dakota. And it was set up in about 1918 predominantly to regulate farm prices. And every single municipality, county, park board, school board below the state was required to invest in that state bank. So you had this ongoing stream of capital. Now, if we were to do this at the city level, who would invest in us? The park board? I mean, we already give the park board money. The school board? This is not going to happen. And then, a lot of the argument, which I can fully understand, for some form of municipal bank would be to give out loans at low or no interest rates to people of lower incomes. And I totally buy into that, and I get it. But here's the one problem with it. Let's say we give out a loan to a person of a lower income. They're not able to pay it off. They ultimately default. The city starts to foreclose. People protest. And for good reason, because they're upset that someone is losing their home, and the city council says, all right, you know what, we're not going to foreclose on this person. Suddenly, it's only a matter of months until the bank is insolvent, we've got no more money left in the city, and we're back where we started yet again. Now, we have the ability at the city, we have bonding capacity. We have the ability to give out low or no interest loans. We have the ability to give out forgivable loans. And I think we should absolutely be doing that for some of our low-income communities. We can give out the ability to have down payment assistance. We can write down the land that we own to give it out to people at lower rates so that then they can start a life and start building generational wealth. But having a municipal bank is not the way to do it.
Mayor Hodges, what's your view about ending the relationship with banks like Wells Fargo that are involved in the fossil fuel industry?
Well, I think it's a legitimate question for anybody to ask where our money goes and how it's used. Certainly in my personal life, I've asked that question about investments that I've had or that I do have. And I think it's legitimate as a community for people to ask the question, how are our tax dollars being spent and how are they being invested? And that's what the city's doing. But whether or not we have our own bank, I'll just say no.
You said it's a legitimate question. Okay, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. What's your position, though? Do you think the city ought to be seriously considering ending its relationship with banks like Wells Fargo that are at odds with maybe some of the policy positions of city officials?
Well, in the spirit of Tom Hoke, we are waiting to get the report back from the staff that the council asked but I do know that when we've looked at these in years past, and particularly with Wells Fargo, because this question was asked during the foreclosure crisis, the actual amount of cash we have with Wells Fargo is not high enough to make a dent in Wells Fargo. But, again, it's a legitimate question to ask, and the council can make decisions as they want. But what I want to make sure we're doing is giving support to people in the community, and that we are holding everybody to the highest standards that we can and the highest expectations that we have about making sure that people are operating with fair business practices. And I know that Wells Fargo has been called out on that, and that Wells Fargo is having to answer those questions.
Okay, so I understand you're waiting for a report, but as the mayor of the city, we've got a fairly large finance industry, as you know, in the city, and there's certainly a lot of talk about is Minneapolis now going to be looking to be ending or choosing which banks they're going to work with based on policy issues. Does that seem to you as a general idea, the direction that you'd like the city to go in?
I think that you can start down a dangerous path if you have a whole bunch of litmus tests for who you do business with and who you don't. I think that can, taken to excess, be a big problem. I don't think asking under these circumstances is a big problem. I think asking once at a time when there's the question on the table in Minneapolis is more about is about banking in general, and it's specifically geared toward Wells Fargo, as far as I can tell from the council member who brought it forward. And I think there are some legitimate questions to be asked at a time when we did have a crisis in the banking industry, a foreclosure crisis, and an economy tumble around our ears for many years, and that there are legitimate questions to be asked there at this time. If you take it to a logical or illogical conclusion about every interaction, you have so many lenses on every interaction that you can no longer do business. Well, that's a whole different story.
A follow-up, Ms. Levy-Pounds, we talked about Wells Fargo. Is it appropriate to end a relationship with a company that does lending in the oil and gas industry? What are your views on that?
Well, I think one way to look at the issue is the fact that Minneapolis prides itself on being progressive. And if we look at the evidence, I think that that's called into question in terms of some of our practices, and the fact that we have not intentionally used the leverage that we have as a city to hold banks like Wells Fargo accountable, which, as Mayor Hodges said, it's not the first time that people have brought up concerns about that particular bank. And when folks were bringing up those concerns, I don't think they were expecting the city to try to develop a municipal bank, which I think is asinine. Because the city, unfortunately, has demonstrated inequitable practices throughout, and those same practices will be replicated through a bank being established. I think a better solution is to invest in Blexit, which is a Black-owned credit union, which would be the first Black-owned credit union in the state of Minnesota, located in North Minneapolis. And it's because people are tired of the inequitable treatment that they're facing at the hands of banks in terms of lending practices, in terms of what happened with the foreclosure crisis, in terms of investing in the Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, the reality is that we need to start holding big banks accountable. And if we're not willing to do that, then I question whether we are actually progressive.
Mr. Rockman, perhaps you'd comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually brought this issue up to a Northeast auto mechanic, and his analogy was, okay, so my house is on fire and you're selling me a new lawnmower. Like, we have bigger issues to worry about in Minneapolis than this. We have a 25% poverty rate. Let's work on that. So if we want to open up a bank, that means, all right, so we got, 100 employees? There's a couple of $10 million over there. Right now we got 3 staff members probably working on this. That's tens of thousands of dollars. We could have funded a free higher education for a couple of students in Minneapolis with those tens of thousands of dollars. So I think it is very symptomatic of how City Hall tends to act nowadays, and it probably has for generations, which is ignoring the central issues of the city in pursuit of these pet projects. And one example I'm going to throw in here. We are right now as a city spending $11 million on a half-a-block park in front of the convention center. Now, who is that park for? Because it's not for us. It's not for people I grew up with. She can clap if she wants. It's a free country. There we go. Now, here's the thing. That's where I stand on the city bank. It doesn't make sense. Everyone knows it doesn't make sense. Nonetheless, we have a couple of publicly paid people in City Hall right now working on it. I'm tired of it. We shouldn't have that. We absolutely shouldn't have it.
Mr. Representative Dean, what's your view about the city ending its relationship with banks including Wells Fargo, but perhaps other banks that are involved in the fossil fuel industry. Do you support that?
Well, I think it's easy to talk about the fossil fuel industry. I mean, big banking is involved in a lot of different things that, quite frankly, don't advantage certain pockets of our city. As a matter of fact, they disadvantage beyond, funding of oil and gas pipelines. There's issues around some of these banks actually
but
have.
Just to get back to the question,
sure.
Do you support the city ending its relationships with banks that are involved in the fossil fuel industry?
I think we need to look beyond just the fossil fuel industry.
So then you would extend that.
Absolutely.
Let's end it in fossil fuel. Let's end it with investment in
You're not just adding things, but I think you need to consider more than just the fossil fuel. I think you need to consider that a lot of these banks are behind check cashing outlets, which prey specifically on poor communities. That takes the wealth out of those communities and makes it more and more difficult for people actually to do better. So we need to look at all of the things, not just one thing, in making our decisions relative to banking, whether it's with U.S. Bank, Wells Fargo, any of the other major banks that the city does business with.
And so does it make sense to you as an extension of that to then say, yeah, we should look at a publicly owned bank?
I'm not sure that publicly owned bank is the solution, but we need to use our leverage to make sure that they're acting responsibly, not just for the city and the functioning of government, but for the people of our city as well. Because if they're not doing things that are actually helping our city, we need to be really concerned about how we're perpetuating the practices of many big banks that are truly extracting wealth out of certain neighborhoods and certain communities in our city.
Well, thank you very much. Let's move on to a new topic. We should talk about taxes, property taxes. Increased 5.5% in 2017, one of the largest increases in years. Please tell us your thoughts about property tax increases if you are mayor. And Mr. Rockman, you want to start us?
This is one of the central issues of the campaign. So it's 5.5% in that year. Over the term of Betsy Hodges, it has gone up twice the rate of population. 11% is how much it has gone up. And that's accounting for inflation. So we as a city are paying a lot in property tax. It's not a small concern. And my stance on it is that, and everyone here again, I love all of you, my concern is mostly with North and Northeast Minneapolis. My concern is with people who have been generationally left behind, completely behind. And when property taxes go up at this rate, the people who suffer the most are the people who have been suffering for the longest. They're the ones who have to leave their apartments because now their rent has gone up because property owners don't pay the rent themselves. I mean, they don't pay for the property tax themselves. They pass it on to their renters. So when it comes to property taxes, it's one of the main reasons why housing is becoming unaffordable in Minneapolis. So my stance on it is the next mayor should, and in my case must, commit to stabilizing the property tax rate for every single citizen in Minneapolis.
Representative Dean?
Well, I think we should consider our property tax in the total context of what residents pay within the city of Minneapolis. We talk about the last 2 years. I would like individuals to actually go back to 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, which we actually had very, very smaller increase in taxes, but we also had a devaluation of property. Part of what's increasing the rapid increase is actually valuation of property. We recovered from a very, very troubled economy for a period of time. And I think that although people look at it in the context of what's happened over the past 10 to 15 years, it's probably not as drastic as we'd like to think. I think it's important that we understand that we're a city, we have lots of wealth, and that sometimes it's okay to raise the taxes on some folks who can afford it. Because quite frankly, as Aswar mentioned, it's becoming difficult for people to afford rents.
Okay.
And quite frankly, part of that is, some of that is the property taxes for the landlords, but a lot of it is the market factors that are coming into play. If the landlord down the street is charging $1,200 a month for the same unit that you had been charging $1,000 a month, your incentive is to do that. So we need to begin to work with landlords and realize that it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. And one of those might be relative to some type of property tax abatement, forgiveness, some type of incentive to have them hold those units as stable rents.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hope?
Wait, can I just follow up? Sure. You said sometimes it makes sense for property taxes to go up. How about, if you're elected and you're a mayor, should we expect property taxes to go up 10, 15, 20% over the course of your term? Or would you say, no, that's not going to happen under my term? Can you give us some clear guidance on expectations?
Well, property taxes are an indication of the overall budget. When the city spends money for services, public safety, all those types of things, there's a cost associated with that. When they spend money on road repair and other types of things, there's a cost associated with that. So ultimately, you have to look at the total budget to make the determination on what the property tax increases should be, and then where are the parts of the city that may have an overburden, and where are the parts of the city that currently may have an underburden relative to the people in the income
So if
state
you
range?
made a commitment, I'm just holding this out as a hypothetical, to holding property taxes to under 5% increase during your term if you were to be elected, then you would have to turn around and say, costs in the city now have to be stringently policed to make sure they don't go up. And we've seen that, in Minnesota and other states where the commitment on property taxes and holding it relatively stable or at a low rate of increase results in a pretty strict approach to spending. Would you be willing to go that far or not?
I wouldn't be willing to go that far. Where I'd be willing to go is to talk about looking at some of those expenses and what it means. I mean, we talked previously about minimum wage. If we have more people that actually are making better wages and not struggling as much, is that going to have an impact on our public safety costs? It might. We might not have to spend as much on policing in some communities, which then frees up money to be used in other parts and other services.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hoke, on the property taxes?
Well, you're right, the property taxes went up 5.5% last year, and they went up about 50% between 2007 and 2012. So property taxes can be hugely destabilizing to a city. It can drive people who can pay it somewhere else and have the opportunity to leave. And it's also the most regressive form of tax because it has nothing to do with your income. So, the job of the mayor is to figure out how to be the conductor of an orchestra, and all of these pieces have to fit together and work well. So as we think about property taxes, the other, of course, unintended consequence is that we create unaffordable housing. So now we're chasing after trying to resolve that issue as well. So property taxes are a huge concern. I know they're a huge concern for businesses. My goal would be to limit property tax increases as much as possible. It's a fundamental way that we need to think about doing business. We need to be careful as a city that we're as good at subtracting as we are at addition.
Councilmember Fry, what's the expectation for property taxes if you were mayor?
Well, property taxes, as Tom Hoke pointed out, they are a regressive form of tax. But when we talk about property taxes going up, or at least the percentage, that's not based on the incremental level that each individual is paying, but rather the overarching levy, and that's not necessarily the same thing. Exactly. And so, what I would talk about is how we've increased the tax base dramatically in the ward I represent, and how that has contributed to keeping the property taxes more steady. And if you look at future years, it'll keep them even more steady than that. The city has grown, but the reality is about 40% of that growth in total has happened in the ward that I represent. So we've taken parcels that were previously paying about $35,000 on an annual basis in property taxes, surface parking lots, and in the near future, they're going to be paying $2.5 million in property taxes. And that's not based on any form of demolition. That's not based on any displacement whatsoever. That's taking a parcel that was previously unused and now using it, suddenly generating revenue that you can use to then do good things in our city, like affordable housing, like street repair, like expanding our infrastructure. These are all things we can do, but we have to be first thinking about a world-class city in order to get there. So are property taxes and the levy going to go up if as we do this? Absolutely, it will, because that's the overarching value figure that we're now gaining additional revenues from. But as you do that, I think you can steady off what each individual taxpayer is paying, and you need to do it.
So, that's very attractive, and it's a win-win-win.
Yeah.
I think
That's
I got
the motto, right?
the right
It's like-
number of
it's
wins
an
in there.
orchestra, like Tom Holt pointed out.
But to the extent that we live in a real world and there are trade-offs, walk us through how you would kind of prioritize raising property taxes versus reining in spending. And, I'm particularly sensitive here to property owners, families that are on tight budgets, or small businesses that are finding themselves really, they kind of look at mounting costs of being in Minneapolis and just wondering if this is the place for them.
Yeah,
So give us how you would prioritize property taxes going up versus discipline on the spending.
So when I talk to people around the city about property taxes, it's not that they're against property taxes going up. It's that they want to make sure that their dollars are used both efficiently and with purpose. And they're not always convinced that that's the case, and yeah, I don't blame them. We need to be focusing on those 2 or 3 initiatives that we're gearing towards entirely, rather than doing a buckshot approach. We need to say 1, 2, and 3. Knocking them out one by one to ensure that, yes, we are using our dollars efficiently, but here's the second piece, and I want to be very clear with this. As these new developments go up, we have more money in the budget to spend.
So this
that's
is
not, and so I'll disagree with that. It's necessarily a trade-off, because it doesn't need to be if we've got more money in the bank. Period. I mean, that's just how the system will work.
Okay. Ms. Levy-Pounce, property taxes?
Well, number one, with all due respect, Jacob, I'm not sure that you're living in the real world in terms of what really happens in a community, especially when we just focus on one ward and not the unintended consequences to the rest of the city. That's part of what's happened as far as displacement, concerns about gentrification, and all of the things I've seen on Facebook from African Americans, Latinos, others representing our immigrant communities, about them receiving letters saying that all of a sudden they have 3 months to pay double the rent or they're going to be out. That is a recent phenomenon, and I would argue that there is a correlation between this 5.5% increase in property taxes and what's actually happening on the ground to real people who are struggling to survive. I was stunned when I saw that huge increase in property taxes and wondered who was actually consulted before that happened. So I think that part of good governance is making sure that you have a track record for sound decision making, and that you are taking a balanced approach and looking at spending, looking at the impacts of property tax increases on people before making such a decision. And I hold the entire city council and our mayor responsible for making that decision. And we see the impacts every day in real life and on social media of how people are being affected by what's going on. Beyond that, the city is holding on to hundreds of lots. And the question is why? When we have an affordable housing crisis, when we have increases in homelessness, especially amongst youth of color, and even the programs that are being put in place, they're not going to help people of color who want to remain in the city. All it's doing is contributing to gentrification. And so we need to have a stronger track record for sound decision making in the city, take a more holistic approach, and actually care about the people who make up this city and not just big business and developers.
Can I respond to that?
Wait a second. We're going to come right back to you in a second.
I think it's Mayor Hodges' turn to address this. Thank you.
Well, I mean, the value that I carry is making sure we're investing in Minneapolis and Minneapolitans, and we're investing well. And I am the person on stage who was at City Hall during year after year after year of cuts from the state to our local government aid program. And I won't go into a whole thing about what local government aid is, except that it's a revenue sharing program, and we kept sending our money to the state, and Governor Pawlenty and Republicans kept cutting how much we were getting back. And those are the dollars that we use to pay for public safety, for road repair, and for the operations of the city. And to make sure that we were as safe a city as possible, we disinvested year after year after year in our streets and our bridges and in our roads. And so now we are, and then we had, and then I was on the council when we had a foreclosure crisis, when we had a recession, when we had an economic crisis at the city. I was there leading our budget committee as we were making decision after decision about what cuts we could make, how we could cut back services to people, and again, decisions about, core functions that we were doing our best to keep thriving. And yes, hard times wrings out efficiencies from the system. But at some point, you are wringing that fabric so hard that it starts to fray. And that is what was happening in the city of Minneapolis. So I just want us all to remember that as now that we are approaching growth. Now, to correct Councilmember Fry, we actually don't get the benefit of growth in our levy unless we levy for it. The levy is just a dollar amount. If our properties grow and they keep doing really well, what happens is your property tax, your portion of the property taxes goes down. But the city doesn't see any of that in our budget unless we levy for it. So I levy for a portion of that growth so that we could reinvest in our streets and in our parks and in our public safety to make up for years of disinvestment by the state. And you can argue the local government aid program if you want, but we send all of our sales tax to the state and we expect to get some back in local government aid. That's the Minnesota miracle that kept us on top for so many years. And that's the Minnesota miracle that the Republicans have been continually trying to undermine for the last decade and a half. If we just kept all our sales tax in Minneapolis, we would be fine. We'd be ahead. But we want everybody in Minnesota to succeed. We want everybody to have good streets and roads and good schools. But we need them too. So when this year's budget came up, we have a financial policy with me as mayor that we acknowledge that the city doesn't get more money unless we leverage more money. If we don't account for inflation and current service levels, it's a cut. So I put that in the baseline of our property tax every year. Add on top of that the agreement, the landmark agreement between the parks and the city council and me. I was the one who insisted that our streets be proportionally part of our investment in those streets and roads for 20 years, but now we have it. So that's in there. And then, yes, an investment in public safety, which is what a large portion of that 5.5% increase went for. But remember, because we're growing, a 5.5% increase on the levy doesn't mean a 5.5% increase on your taxes. Most people experienced it as a cut or their taxes stayed the same. That is a responsible tax policy. That is giving consideration to all the context and all the climates because business needs us investing in our streets.
Thank you very much. Al Flowers?
Boy,
Your view about
this is like a filibuster or something. I don't know what's going on here, but I want to say we should try never to raise property tax. I think Minneapolis residents are some of the greatest residents in the state, and over 30 years being in Minneapolis, and it's always been fair. It's not the residents, it's the politicians, it's the ones in City Hall that they had opportunity after opportunity. Jacob Fry, Councilmember Fry talks about. We can do this with bonding. We can do this, change the method that they use. Millions of dollars came from the federal government to help people that was below the medium income to try to get them in housing, and the city squandered it. That's Mayor Hodges was a city council member then. That they squandered all this opportunity. And that's why where we at right now, because they continue to do that. They'll come out here and campaign, but they're not telling the truth about some of these issues. You shouldn't have to raise property tax. I look at the city when the school board. Here's a school board that squanders money all the time, and the residents will do a referendum and give you back $40 million without asking a question. This is a great city. What we have to do is hold the city council and the mayor accountable. It's opportunities to take people out of poverty. You don't talking about the $15 minimum wage. Talk about affordable housing. They're changing positions as we speak. Every week it's a new position on affordable housing. They've had these opportunities all the time. You don't need to raise property. Leave the residents alone and get your business in order downtown in City Hall. This is what I think we have to do. We got to hold them accountable, not after November. We keep letting them, we let the politicians go after November. We can't do that anymore. It's dangerous out, on some parts of the city that some people don't know. I've been going around to every ward talking to awards, and I'm speaking to predominantly white audience saying, we need your help in North Minneapolis. We need you. I want you to stop from seeing people get killed. They don't want you to know it's happening. They don't want it in the media. They're trying to keep downtown clean for the Super Bowl. That's what it's all about now, and it's a targeted program going on right now. So I'm going to keep going, and we don't need to raise anybody property tax. We need to get do what we have already there, and make something happen, and we can sue Wells Fargo.
We've run out of time, and I know some of you have got to run off, so I want to do a quick round of thank yous. First, I want to thank the Chamber of Minneapolis for co-sponsoring this with us. None of these events happen by accident, so I want to thank our staff, Myra Burnett, who's right back here, great musician, by the way. You should check out Myra's band. Lee Chittenden, who is the maestro for our public events and runs our election administration program, and the great and amazing Kate Cimino, who, in addition to everything she does, is the person who runs the Policy Fellows program with me. If you don't know about it, ask Kate. It's an incredible program. I want to thank all of you. This has been a great, great audience. Delighted to see so many people. Thank you for being so patient and attentive. And I want to thank these candidates. I can tell you, I follow city politics all over the country. It's going to be very hard to find a group of candidates as thoughtful and really caring about the city. And it's very, kind of diverse set of people that are now making Minneapolis so special and tolerant. Very civil, right? Let's give them a round of applause. And thank you, Lee Schaefer.
Thank you.